A bowl of lobster bisque landed on her head as if someone had decided to paint a private humiliation in broad daylight. Heat soaked into the silk at her shoulder. The room inhaled and then broke into the brittle sound of too many phones recording at once. Laughter rose, brief, sharp, from a man in a tuxedo who believed he could make a spectacle of anyone and call it entertainment. He thought he owned the room. He did not know in that moment that the woman standing there with soup in her hair was the owner of the one deal he needed to survive. He did not know that the eyes narrowing behind her calm were years of meetings, a mother's sacrifice, nights spent counting every cent to keep a company afloat. He believed a gesture, an insult, could puncture what she had built. He was wrong. Stay with this story. See how a moment of cruelty became the unraveling of an empire. 48 hours earlier, Jordan Wells lived in a narrow brownstone that smelled of coffee and laundry soap. Her staircase creaked at the same spot where, years before, her mother had insisted the family eat together, no matter how late she came home. On the hallway table, a framed photograph leaned at a slight angle. Evelyn Wells, in a simple dress, arms folded across her chest, smile patient and certain. The photo had a scuff where Jordan's daughter had once dropped it. Jordan had never fixed it. She liked the imperfection. It reminded her that dignity persisted even when nothing was polished. By dawn, she had already opened her laptop. Vertex Capital Holdings began as a small investment fund that bought single brownstones with equity pooled from friends and tenants who trusted Jordan's steady hand. It had become a company that flipped buildings into reliable, affordable homes. Jordan had never wanted to be a headline. She had wanted stability for other people who looked like the people who raised her. Mothers who worked graveyard cleaning shifts. Young men who tried and failed to get a footing in a city determined to push them out. Evelyn had been one of those mothers. She had worked in an office tower downtown, in a building that bore the name of a man who smiled for charity galas and whose logo was on the same programs Jordan now held. Evelyn lost that job after an incident the company never explained to a weary housewife with 2 kids. The weeks after had been the kind that taught Jordan how scarcity sharpened a person. Evelyn died broken proud 3 years later. Jordan kept a notebook of the small bills and big humiliations stacked like stones that built the foundation of her ambition. She did not keep it to punish the dead. She kept it so she would never forget why she would never allow the same erasure to happen to others. Maya Carter arrived at the brownstone just as Jordan was stepping out. Maya's coat was too bright, her movement precise, the kind of presence that read problems before they were spoken. She had been Jordan's assistant for 4 years and had built herself into Jordan's closest strategist. Where Jordan saw a market, Maya saw the threads connecting paper to motive. Contracts, past lawsuits, personalities that left traces. "Morning," Maya said, dropping a tablet onto the kitchen table like it carried a small storm. On its screen, rows of numbers blinked beneath margins in red. Bank raft-off filings, Q3 through Q4, cash flow shrinking, investor confidence down 20% over the last quarter. Jordan flicked a glance, more at the headline than the spreadsheets. "They've been under the microscope. They're deeper than you think." Maya had been discreet until she could not be. And it's not just numbers. There are complaints, terminations with suspicious patterns, former employees saying the same things. Management silence. When I pulled security memos, there were memos where supervisors were told to manage the optics of certain tenants. There's a line item flagged as client discretion that has names tied to low-income tenants. The architecture of their decisions looks personal. Jordan set the kettle on the stove and let the hiss fill the short silence between them. How much of that is relevant to CEK? A lot. Maya tapped the screen. CEK's counsel is nervous. They want clean narratives. They're worried Braftoft's public image is pristine. Charitable donations, gala photos. But under the gloss, the underwriting is rotten. If anything blows up, they will pull. Their lawyers already asked for an indemnity clause if anything from his personal conduct risks the merger. Jordan listened as if to a weather report. The merger had been a quiet ambition in her desk drawer for months. CEK was the public-facing company at the center of a consolidation Jordan had orchestrated to preserve affordable housing with real capital and governance. The deal with Braftoft Properties was meant to be a lifeline to finish the acquisition of a portfolio of distressed properties and to seed the Wells Community Development Fund she planned to name for her mother. The figure attached to the agreement was a round, headline-grabbing number that in the papers would read like salvation, a $1 billion purchase commitment, a merger that promised scale, and a messy kind of legitimacy. "It's his oxygen," Maya said. "If CEK withdraws, those investors have nowhere palatable to go. The market will smell blood." Jordan folded her hands around a mug and thought of Evelyn's face in the photograph. "He helped to do what he did to her," she said quietly. It was not an accusation thrown into a room. It was a fact she had kept like a coal in her pocket. They both knew Braftoft's face. Richard Braftoft, philanthropist, art collector, the man who gave speeches about uplifting communities while his corporation managed them like aesthetic problems, tidy facades, evictions swept under carpets. On stage, he wore conceit as an accessory. Off it, he ran a tight ship where employees who raised issues slipped away softly, their departures catalogued as resignations. Jordan had reasons to be patient. Power did not always fall because of a single act, no matter how viral. She had built her company with patience and contract law and leverage. Her ownership of CEK was not public. It was wrapped through a trust she had arranged so her deals could move without the theatrics of ego. That anonymity was a kind of insurance. It allowed her to watch Braftoft from the inside, to see how he performed his virtue on camera, to read the memos he would never write publicly. It allowed her to keep a ledger longer than most people had patience for. "Tonight's the gala," Maya said. "You know he'll be there." The Manhattan Grand Ballroom was gilded enough to flatten a person's sense of proportion. Chandeliers like upside-down constellations. A carpet patterned with the kind of curves that made shoes click louder. Waiters in tuxedos moving in practiced geometry. Arrivals were a procession. Families and foundations rehearsing their leisure for an audience of donors. On the program, Braftoft's name was printed in italics that suggested history. Television cameras found faces with practiced smiles. The crowd had that peculiar hunger of any room full of people who knew they would later be photographed for having been here. Jordan wore a conservative dress the color of Riverstone, not to disappear, but to stay unremarked. She arrived with Maya and a small group that included a couple of junior directors from Vertex, a woman from CEK's legal team who had the new indemnity clauses open on her tablet, and a man from an advocacy nonprofit Jordan supported. For months, Jordan had been careful about public exposure. She moved through the room with the flat, measured kindness of someone who had learned to avoid drama. Braftoft moved like a man who lived on applause. He was in a tux that fit him like a second skin. His smile suggested he knew the exact cadences to own the room. He stood at a place where his wife, Elizabeth, joined him, and children circulated in designer fabrics that made the waiters glance and adjust plates. He greeted donors with a seasoned performance, sliding into topics of corporate social responsibility, with the same hand he used to smooth napkins. Jordan caught his eye as if by accident. For a moment their gazes collided like two ships noting a lighthouse. He recognized her, not because she had been a public figure, but because there are faces certain men remember. Faces of people who once worked for them, who had been inconveniently close. He smiled in a way that did not land near kindness. The buffet was an island of abundance, chafing dishes, platters that looked choreographed. Waiters circulated in a ballet that sometimes resembled opulence disguised as necessity. Jordan moved toward a small plate, the way someone who had lived through scarcity chooses a portion, and still leaves the table with a measure of restraint. Braftoft watched her through lenses polished by his brand. It took 2 steps for a man like Braftoft to become a spectacle maker. He did not plan cruelty in the calculus of his public persona. He tested it like a scientist testing a volatile compound. A light remark, a shove, then the theater of reaction. A joke, an object lesson. This was a room where men like him rehearsed small humiliations and called them lessons in hierarchy. When his hand closed on a ladle, no one thought at first, because the world is trained to slow down for a moment then gloss, until the steam rose against Jordan's cheek and a warm, lumpy curtain of lobster bisque hit her hair and ran, scenting the air with cream and something undeniably domestic. For one breath the laughter was delayed, as if the room forgot that it had to be polite and simply registered the breach. Then he laughed. The laugh was the crime. It was a sound that made everyone reach for their phones and their defenses. Phones rose like hands in church. Clips started. 2 separate accounts uploaded within minutes. In the dim glow of chandeliers and studio lights, Jordan stood with warmth soaking her sleeve. She did not scream. She did not retaliate. She looked at him the way a person looks at a tool they have no time for. "You always did like scenery," he said, voice carrying in the small acoustics of a room hungry for gossip. Jordan wiped her palm across her dress as if to erase the heat there, and also as if to steady a body that knew how to keep composure when the world wanted to strip it away. She said quietly, with the kind of clarity that made a hush where gossip might have been, "Thank you for showing me who you are." The phrase landed with a gravity that surprised even her. It was not a line she had rehearsed. It was what came when someone stripped away the mask and revealed a truth. The room faltered. Laughter stuttered, and then resumed at the perimeter, nervous, unsure if contempt was still required. Phones were still filming. No one helped. No one touched her shoulder. In the crowd, cameras recorded at different angles. Someone in the balcony caught the arc of the Bisque, the glint of a heel, the exact moment her face registered that this would not be just a hurt. It would be evidence. The man who had once closed on a ladle became, in seconds, a figure clipped into 1,000 small frames and saved under 1,000 stranger file names. Jordan left the ballroom like someone walking out of a trap. The cool night air in Manhattan hit her, as if it had editorialized the event and sided with her. She flagged a car and asked to go home. There were polite whispers behind her. There were faces that pretended not to have seen. She did not look for sympathy. She looked at the streetlights and the reverberation of the cameras in them, as if they were stars burning small and close. By dawn, the footage had crossed oceans. Maya had known to plant the seed of patience in Jordan's mind days earlier. But viral law is not something patience alone can govern. Phones had mouths that could not be shut. Views climbed in the thousands, then millions. The first upload had a timestamp, 11:42 p.m. An overlay showed 4.3 million views by 6 a.m. The next edit, a sharper angle, had 1 million in the pre-dawn hour. Early hashtags folded around the incident like vines. Braftoff behavior. Dignity under fire. News channels pulled the video in 30-second clips. The tone of commentary was immediate. Some framed it as a misunderstanding, others as proof of a pattern. Opinion feeds split, but the footage was neutral. It recorded a man, a bowl, a woman. The world wrote its own explanations around that stillness. Braftoft's phone began to burn. He answered it at first with the old swagger, jokes, denials. By mid-morning, his voice cut into a threadbare panic. Lawyers started to say the same words. Control the narrative. Prepare a statement. Consult PR. Family members called. Elizabeth, his wife, sent a terse message to a private group. This is not publicity. His children, Madison and Tyler, replied in private messages that would not remain private. Screenshots leaked, then multiplied. Somewhere, a board member sent a short, blunt note. We need a briefing. Another. Investors are asking for comments. Investors smelled risk in a way that smelled like opportunity. The Braftoft property stock wavered at the open, a jitter that became a dip, then an ugly slide. The market does not pause for dignity. A drop of 6% became 12% by the afternoon as hedge funds and mutuals measured PR damage in dollar terms and moved money out. The company's debt ceilings were re-examined in the kind of ruthless arithmetic that makes cheerless men smile at numbers. CEK's counsel, who had been circling for months with a clause like a life preserver, called in a morning meeting. They did not mention the gut reaction that their clients had money to lose and little appetite for reputational risk. They spoke in contract. They pointed to a clause, Section 14, Paragraph 3 of the merger agreement, the morality clause, language that stated conduct by a principal that could materially and adversely affect the value or reputation of the combined entity would give CEK grounds to terminate the agreement. The clause was a legal hinge. It had been negotiated months earlier, a tiny decisive lever waiting to be pulled if the wrong person misstepped in public. Jordan watched the numbers climb and fall from the window of her brownstone. The kitchen clock ticked with a patience she sometimes wished she had. Maya hovered near the door, phone in hand, eyes sharp. "They'll try to spin it," Maya said. "He'll call it a joke, an accident. People who support him will circle, but this is more than a moment. Those memos you asked me to dig up, they're looking like a pattern. Pattern is what turns a spectacle into a case study. Pattern is what turns a tweet into a legal argument." At noon, someone from an advocacy group Jordan supported texted a headline: "Former janitor at Braftoft Tower speaks out." A short clip followed. A woman named Maria Santos recounting how, years ago, her mother had been told to move her family's small services out of an elevator schedule to make room for a charity donor. The clip lasted 35 seconds and cut to black. In it, Maria's voice was steady as a tool. "They did not think our lives mattered," she said. "They thought they owned the building and the people in it." The clip became a thread people followed to linked stories of tenants charged extra maintenance and staff layoffs masked as efficiency. Eyes found the line between spectacle and system. Braftoft had a typical arsenal: lawyers with crisp suits and PR teams that wrote with the cadence of apology without admission. He moved through them like a man who believed he could grease the machinery of forgiveness. He scripted a statement. "I regret that this was perceived as humiliating. It was not my intent." He posted a photograph of a donated check to an arts program. He filmed a short, flat video promising to investigate the incident himself. None of it landed. The footage did. By evening, a rumor reached Jordan's inbox. CEK's executive committee had convened an emergency call. "They're circling," a contact wrote. "They're watching the optics. If this goes any further, they might pull." Jordan did not celebrate. She did not allow herself to taste a victory that had not yet been claimed. The sound of people wanting something to be true because it simplified a story was familiar. She had seen movements collapse under their own noise. But she had prepared for this kind of pressure. She had spent years learning to convert moral outrage into structural outcomes. The difference between a spectacle and accountability was the law, the ledger, and follow-through. The difference between humiliation and justice was not that one was louder than the other. It was that one had witnesses and records and governance behind it. At 2 a.m, she returned to the footage as if she were reading for edits in a screenplay. She watched the bowl arc. She watched Braftoft laugh. She watched herself stand and speak. The clip that had 3 different angles stitched together made a mosaic of the room's complicity. Faces that pretended not to see. A plate passively placed back on a buffet. A pause that felt like permission. She rewound the point where the bisque hit the shoulder and watched the ripple on the silk as if the tiny waves were the map to a much larger pattern. There were messages that night from people she had never met. "Thank you for staying calm. That could have been my mother. We are so sorry this happened." There were offers from journalists who wanted to profile her. There were older notes from tenants who remembered Evelyn and signed a line under a short testimony. She always dressed neat. She worked hard. She did not deserve to be thrown away. Jordan set the phone face down. The act of setting it like that was the only ritual she had left that felt private. She thought of Evelyn not as a symbol, but as a person who had navigated ordinary indignities with a kind of economy of grace. Jordan had learned that true leverage was not theatrical. It was quiet, contractual, and patient. It involved papers and meetings and patience. It involved being anonymous publicly while owning the mechanism of power privately. She woke the next morning with a plan that did not mention revenge. The plan mentioned law. It mentioned witnesses. It mentioned the morality clause she had helped to craft for CEK precisely because men like Braftoft made the headlines for their generosity, while their institutions bled people dry. It mentioned the supply chain of complaint memos Maya had unearthed. It mentioned former employees who had told the truth but been ignored. "It will be messy," Maya said when Jordan told her to schedule a meeting with CEK Council. "It will draw us into the public fray whether we want it or not. They will ask you about being the owner of CEK. They will ask about optics." Jordan made a simple decision. She would not hide any longer behind a name when the steering wheel was turned toward justice. If the morality clause was the hinge, she would see whether the hinge swung the door open. She would not make the same mistake Evelyn had been punished for. believing an apology would somehow restore what was taken. Word moved faster than the morning. Editors called asking for comment. Friends called with counsel and warnings. A journalist texted, "Are you represented?" An acquaintance from a nonprofit wrote, "We can support statements." Jordan turned all those away. She did not need the chorus. She needed the law and the quiet machinery of proof. She needed her team. CX counsel agreed to an emergency consultation. They were cautious. They explained the morass of publicity lawyers and clause language. They read from the merger agreement and highlighted the paragraph that said that conduct by a principal that could materially and adversely affect the reputation of the combined entity could be cause for termination. It was elegant, clean, and cold. Jordan listened as if to the layering of a trap. "If they cancel," she said, "it will look like opportunism to some and prudence to others. But the important thing is that the pattern is visible. We can prove the pattern." Maya laid out names. "We have a list of former employees willing to speak. Maria Santos is ready to file a statement, and 3 others will corroborate. There are internal memos and HR notes that show removals and reassignments when tenants complained." "Bring them to me," Jordan said. She was not interested in spectacle. She was interested in witnesses. She was interested in how to keep the moral arc honest. By evening, reporters were already framing the story into a narrative they could feed to audiences. Some asked if it was about a billionaire's bad joke. Others asked whether this was the moment when public shame would finally mean something. Jordan knew the camera would prefer a moment, a bowl, a laugh, a woman standing. But she knew the law preferred evidence, hand-signed memos, repeated complaints, testimony under oath. Braftoff's first instinct was to fight the optics. His second was to try to reshape them. He filmed a short statement apologizing for offense caused, adding a rehearsed line about the nature of philanthropy being imperfect. Handlers put together a donation plan to charity, and his social channels flooded with images of art purchases and gala portraits. But the core footage refused to cooperate with nostalgia. It had the stubborn neutrality of a camera. There was a bowl, a man, a woman. The rest were opinions. In the days after, small confessions and corroborations started to surface. A property manager who had left Braftoff's company months earlier sent a testimony to an inbox Jordan did not publicize but kept for a rainy day. He spoke of meetings where the company had considered tenants inconvenient and where a tone of indifference had been mandated as part of a rebranding. An HR director who had been terminated under ambiguous circumstances offered her name in exchange for anonymity. A former tenant sent copies of letters asking for maintenance work that had never been addressed. These were the threads Jordan needed to make a rope. She called one witness herself at 3 in the morning, not because she wanted to intimidate, but because she wanted to listen without an intermediary. The woman on the other end of the line had a name Jordan would remember: Maria Santos. Maria had a voice that carried the flatness of someone who had been wronged enough times to be economical with anger. She recounted being shuffled in and out of scheduling, the slow erasure of service contracts that cleaned out apartments of working families. She spoke of her mother being fired from Braftoff's building with no explanation. "It is like they lunged and then forgot they had lunged at anyone at all," Maria said. "They pretended they were only rearranging furniture while people's lives were packed into boxes." Jordan did not promise anything she could not deliver. She promised to listen and to make certain the story had witnesses. Maria agreed to meet counsel. She did not ask for money. She wanted simply for someone to keep a record. By the end of the week, the story had multiplied. There were op-eds that argued public shaming was a dangerous form of justice. There were think pieces that asked whether a single viral clip deserved the power it could wield. There were also modest reports that examined the memos and the patterns and found a seam. No one could have predicted with certainty that a bowl of soup would be a tipping point. History rarely moves in tidy lines, but contempt had a way of making itself visible if someone was willing to trace the lines. Jordan sat at the window of her office one afternoon and watched the market respond in tiny pulses. The ticker numbers were glyphs of consequence. She thought of Evelyn waiting for a pay stub that never came, and of a younger Jordan counting her mother's coins to make rent. She thought of the wells she wanted to build that would not be a mirror of the world that made Evelyn vanish. She picked up a page of notes where she had scribbled the potential outcomes: PR fallout, legal filings, board votes, the morality clause. She wrote one more line beneath them all, small and deliberate: keep the outcome restorative. She also knew power required timing. She could let outraged waves swallow men like Braftoft and hope the market and his shame did the work. Or she could move the machinery she had built, the contracts, the witnesses, the legal experts, and use them to convert a viral humiliation into structural change. She chose the latter. When CEK's counsel finally asked to talk, Jordan prepared herself not for a fight but for clarity. She would not be baited by the circus. She would not trade dignity for drama. She would meet evidence with procedure, feelings with statutes, outrage with testimony. Outside, the city went on performing itself. Cabs, late buses, the smell of bakeries turning over their ovens. Inside her small kitchen, the photograph of Evelyn looked the same. Jordan placed her palm on the frame and felt the small smile that had taught her resilience. She did not want the world to be tidy. She wanted it to be fair. She had learned these were not the same thing. The next morning she gathered the files Maya had organized: memos, signed complaints, a roster of former employees who were willing to testify, security footage of management meetings. She arranged them like a person setting a table for a necessary meal. The files, when assembled, made a different kind of noise than the viral clips. They made the steady, procedural sound of accountability. They made a promise she could defend. At noon, she walked back into the kind of conference room that used to intimidate her. This time, the room expected her. Chairs had been arranged to face her side of the table like a small audience. CEK counsel had prepared a folder with the merger text. A woman from CEK's board sat across from her with a look of someone balancing loyalty to shareholders and a taste for prudence. "Mr. Braftoft has asked for a meeting," the board representative said. "They are saying he was misinterpreted. They want guidance." Jordan watched the pause where the other side tried to make a narrative. She could feel the decades of small humiliations of people like her pressing at the glass of her ribs. She breathed in, measured, and did what she had always done when clocks and contracts mattered more than theatrics. She let the documents speak. "You will have to decide," she said. "Not because of a clip alone, but because of the pattern we'll show you. We are prepared to present the memos, the HR notes, the witness statements. The clause you negotiated into this merger exists for a moment like this. There is a choice to be made." The woman across from her looked through her glasses at the papers and then at Jordan. "You realize the optics of this are unusual," she said, careful not to say the word power aloud. "I do," Jordan replied. "But I also know that optics are part of accountability. A morality clause is not a theater prop. It was written to protect the combined entity from collapse when leadership is revealed to have behaved in ways that would harm the company's mission. If you value that mission, then you must recognize what this is: an opportunity to align your actions with your stated values." The board representative nodded slowly, the kind of nod that has to do with people weighing responsibilities in numbers and reputations. Jordan left the meeting not with a public victory, but with a private knowledge. Things were shifting. The machinery of law and corporate governance had been engaged. The rest would be a matter of procedure. Outside, the city did what cities do. It moved on and also did not move on. The clip kept circulating. New angles appeared, comments multiplied. Some messages were vicious in defense of Braftoft, accusing Jordan of scheming, of using her anonymity as a weapon. Others were quietly fierce in support. In the flood of noise, Jordan's work was not spectacle. It was papers and witness lists and patient lawyering. It was the conversion of indignity into inquiry. There was a moment that week when Braftoft's children, Madison and Tyler, posted a short statement on private accounts that somehow surfaced publicly. "Our father doesn't represent us in this singular incident," one of them wrote. The kind of small renunciation that reads like a distance being taken before a public falls away. It was not a dramatic divorce from wealth to conscience. It was a note passed at a dinner table that would later be parsed as the first step toward family fallout. In the lobby of her building, a neighbor stopped Jordan with a grocery bag in his hand and said simply, "I saw you on the news. That was hard to watch." He did not ask what she planned to do. He wanted permission to acknowledge the event had happened, In a world that prefers to forget things that make it uncomfortable, Jordan thanked him and told him nothing. She did not need a chorus of sympathy to proceed. She needed proof and patience, and the certain knowledge that a bowl of soup, though small, can break a pattern if it is followed with an unrelenting commitment to accountability. At dusk, she walked past the old storefront where Evelyn had once worked, the one with an awning faded by years of sun. A man on the stoop had left flowers there the day the footage went public. They were ordinary flowers, wrapped in newspaper. Jordan touched a petal and felt the shock of small things that remind you of why you do the work you do. Her phone buzzed with a short message. Emergency call with counsel at 9 a.m. tomorrow. They said it's time. She slept poorly, not from fear, but from the taste of purpose. In the middle of the night she dreamed of a library of small statements and handwritten complaints, each one a brick in a wall that had been built to exclude people like her mother. She woke with the list of names she would call first. What followed was not instantaneous. It was a letting in of many small, steady sounds. The opening of a notebook, a woman agreeing to testify, a counsel writing down dates, the slow appearance of corporate memos that, once read together, sang a chorus of indifference. And in public the bowl stayed there, a piece of evidence as stubborn as a photograph. Clips would later be spliced into curated packages, but for now it simply existed. A man in a tuxedo laughing, and a woman in a stone-colored dress saying quietly, "Thank you for showing me who you are." The words had barely left her mouth when phones multiplied the syllables into 1,000 anonymous echoes. They became captions and headlines, and a single unnerving fact. One man's casual cruelty had been preserved in pixels and sound. That preservation turned an insult into evidence, and evidence in the right hands became a mechanism. By late morning the footage had 3 million views. By noon, the hashtag cluster around his name trended in several countries. A timeline graphic on morning shows flickered. Upload at 11:42 p.m. First rebroadcast at 1:06 a.m. 3 new angles. By 3:12 a.m. News Chiron copy contained the essential beats in staccato. Billionaire humiliates guest. Video goes viral. The newscasters parsed motives and manners as if those were the same thing. The clip did one clear thing the commentary could not erase. It put a bowl of Bisque in the center of a record that otherwise ran on rhetoric. CK's legal team convened an emergency call. There was a short, devastating economy to the language they used. Section 14, paragraph 3. The clause existed because people like Jordan had anticipated that reputations could be weaponized and that a company could be brought low by the misconduct of a principal. It read, in the simplest terms for outsiders, like this: conduct by a principal that materially and adversely affects the reputation or value of the combined entity provided grounds to terminate. In the world of mergers and acquisitions, it was a hinge. That hinge could close a deal or cut it off. On the trading floor, numbers moved like small tectonic plates. Shares of Braftoft Properties opened down 6%. Within a day, the fall had accelerated to 18%, as institutional investors called trading desks and asked blunt questions. Hedge funds that had been positioned to profit from an imminent consolidation began selling into any weakness. The notion that one man's private face could fracture a public company's capitalization made risk managers nervous in a way sympathy could not fix. Braftoft, who had built a brand on performative largesse and immaculate appearances, responded with the old playbook: lamentation without admission, swift donations, a staged listening tour. He filmed a short apology that read like a press release written by someone skilled in commas, but not contrition. "I regret that actions of the evening were perceived as hurtful. That was never my intent." He released a photograph of a check to an arts program. He called his lawyers and repeated like a litany, "This is a misunderstanding." But private messages do not scrub pixels. The memos Mia had dug up and the complaint files Maya had organized were not susceptible to spin. They were documents. They were time-stamped, initialed, and sometimes brutally banal in their phrasing. Manage optics, client discretion, reassigned to mitigate. A former HR director, Kesha Washington, had sworn in a statement that departures often appeared as voluntary in public files and as reassigned in internal memos. A facilities manager, James Tyler, had forwarded an email from 2 years prior that suggested the company had prioritized donor events over tenant maintenance requests. CEK's board met in a windowed room with a view of the river that morning, and the weight of fiduciary duty behind their chairs. Jordan did not attend the first phone call. She let counsel make the move they had been preparing for months. Situational clarity first, headline later. Legal strategy required a simple architecture, presentation of pattern, chain of evidence, invocation of the clause. When CEK's counsel read aloud the relevant paragraph from the merger agreement, the words felt ordinary and absolute. The clause exists to protect the combined entity from reputational harm, the counsel said. We negotiated this for precisely such contingencies. We can argue material adverse effect. A murmur circulated. CEK's executive committee caucused. There were calls back and forth about potential litigation, the likely fallout, the inevitable press. Jordan watched the meeting notes arriving on her phone. She had arranged the anonymity of ownership for strategic reasons. Now that anonymity had an operational cost, her identity would have to surface if corporate governance required a named decision-maker. By early evening, CEK released a statement. Given recent developments and pending investigations, CEK will pause the intended acquisition and is reviewing all contractual rights, including those under Section 14. The statement never said the words cancel or terminate. Those would come only after the word pause failed to soothe markets. The next morning, Jordan requested the meeting no one expected. She walked into Braftoft's office on the 15th floor like a person who had rehearsed nothing and still arrived perfectly prepared. The office smelled faintly of leather and citrus cleaners. He rose, practiced smile waiting at the lip of his face. Behind him, bookshelves held curated objects, sculptures, auction catalogs, a framed letter from a senator. Jordan's presence changed the air like a quiet current. She did not come to perform. She came to inform. You'll want to sit down for this, she said. She did not give him time to decide whether to be humble. I am here on behalf of CEK. Braftoft blinked. He tried a laugh that landed thin. This is a stunt. You think that will reverse anything? He gestured toward the city. I think it will expose what your company has been doing quietly for years, Jordan replied. We have memos, we have HR notes, we have witness statements, we have the pattern, and I am not here to bargain. CEK has rights under the merger agreement. My counsel will move according to the clause if they determine material, adverse effect. He scoffed. You think a bowl of soup is material? I think a bowl of soup is evidence, Jordan said. I think the bowl shows you as you are. The memos show you as you have acted. The two combined are enough to meet your own standard. There was silence long enough that his PR director, who hovered by the door, looked away like someone whose professional life had just been called into question. Braftoft's mouth hardened. He reached for the oldest refuge of power. Bluster. We can survive a scandal. People forgive those who fund the right causes. People forgive money, Jordan interrupted quietly. People don't forgive patterns. And courts don't forgive when patterns have consequences attached to them. Your lawyers can tell you the math of a case. My counsel will too. He tried another tack. Intimidation cloaked in civility. You don't understand what you're meddling with, he said. Jordan put a hand on a nearby chair and leaned forward as if to anchor herself. I understand what I'm preventing, she said. You were the reason my mother lost a job. My family paid for other people's convenience. I will not let that be a footnote. Her voice was soft, but there were decades of small reckonings packed into it. He did not threaten violence. He threatened paperwork. He threatened countersuits. He did what many men in his seat did when fame and fortune failed to protect them. He asked his lawyers to buy time. They filed protective motions and asked for arbitration on contract grounds. They tried to shift the fight into private forums with stringent gag orders and confidentiality clauses. Those motions slowed some wheels, but they could not unring the bell that social media had rung. The criminal inquiry began not from a single prosecutor's whim, but from patterns. Ada Monica Harris, a prosecutor who had spent a career building cases where power and impunity intersected, took an interest. She convened a unit to examine the footage not merely as a social media artifact, but as a possible crime scene. There was, she judged, traditional assault on the table, the intentional application of force without consent. There were also allegations that would complicate the narrative: witness tampering, retaliation against employees, and falsified HR records that could constitute obstruction if shown to be willful. Monica Harris announced an open investigation and asked for witnesses to come forward. The call yielded what the prosecution had hoped for: names, dates, corroborating memos. The arc of their work was procedural and patient. They built indictments the way Jordan had built a company, by collecting documents, securing testimony, and establishing motive and pattern. When charges were filed, the breadth of the case changed. It moved from market calculus to criminal court dockets. The public appetite followed. The headlines adjusted their tone. Billionaire indicted on assault and obstruction charges. That language contained a new kind of friction. The market reacted. The boardroom seat felt colder. Family dinners became fragments caught in feeds. The criminal trial occupied weeks rather than days. Courtrooms, with their muted lighting and oak benches, compress a drama that elsewhere is loud. Ada Monica Harris opened with a cadence that made jurors lean forward. This case is about more than a thrown bowl. It is about a pattern of conduct in which a man used his position to devalue others, and about the attempt to keep that pattern hidden. Tonight's video is evidence. Tomorrow we will show you the files that explain why it mattered. Witnesses came forward with steady voices. Maria Santos described under oath how her mother had been dismissed with a note that read, "Reassignment," yet no new role followed. "We were told the building was being optimized," Maria said. "My mother lost more than a job. She lost the income that made our rent possible." James Tyler produced emails detailing directives to prioritize donor events over tenant maintenance. Kesha Washington, testifying from partial memory and full conscience, told the court about HR notes that were inconsistent with publicly stated reasons for departures. David Park, an internal finance officer who had left under ambiguous circumstances, described redacted budget requests for safety inspections and how they were labeled non-essential the week before a charity gala. Jordan's testimony was brief and precise. She described a childhood narrowed by scarcity, a mother industrious and always dignified, and a career spent building a different kind of capital, social and financial, meant to serve those the market had left behind. Her recounting of the gala was not theatrical. She recounted the arc of the bowl, the sound of the laughter, the decisions she made in the hours after. The jury saw in her what the cameras had seen: a composed person with an array of motivations rooted in more than a single public moment. The defense tried to paint the incident as a misunderstanding, an attempted joke that spiraled, misinterpreted angles and cultural dissonance. They produced character witnesses, philanthropic fellow donors who spoke about his generosity. They called a psychologist to speak of the fragility of public perception. But patterns resist being dismissed as singular flukes. The documents, the repeated memos, and the witness testimonies stitched together a narrative that weighed against the defense's claim of accident. The jury deliberated for 2 days. When the verdict came, the courtroom held its breath like a lung in a city that had been shouting for weeks. Guilty on counts of assault and obstruction. The verdict did not come with a fanfare. It came with the quiet rustle of papers, a few sniffles, and a man whose credibility had once seemed rock-solid looking small under the glow of courtroom lamps. Judge Patricia Carter, who had presided with a steadiness that could be mistaken for coldness, read sentence with the gravity of someone who understood the limits of words to repair harm. She imposed a custodial sentence that reflected both the assault conviction and the obstruction charges, 18 months in a federal facility, along with a fine meant to account for restitution and punitive considerations, and an order mandating corporate oversight conditions for any entities associated with bankrupt properties. The judge's remarks emphasized deterrence and the principle that privilege does not exempt one from the law. Outside the courthouse, the crowd was not uniform. There were people cheering in the street and others shaking their heads at what they saw as law's limitations. Among the cheers were faces of former employees who had come forward, their mouths forming the names of those they had lost to neglect. For Jordan, the conviction felt less like a personal applause and more like a punctuation mark. It signaled that the criminal system, imperfect as it is, had accepted certain boundaries. It did not mean the end of damage or the cure of institutions. It meant that one man would be removed from a position of unmediated power for a time. The civil litigation followed naturally. Class actions were filed on behalf of tenants and former employees alleging systematic discrimination, fraud, and deliberate negligence. Civil suits operate on a different calculus. They were less about punishment than restitution. The civil jury awarded a landmark verdict, $250 million in compensatory and punitive damages, stating in plain language what the criminal case had implied through its evidence. The company's practices had caused real economic and emotional harm. Bankrupt properties could not sustain the twin blows. Creditors pressed, liquidity evaporated, and within months the firm filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. The bankruptcy court appointed a trustee to marshal assets for distribution. Auctions were scheduled. The irony did not go unnoticed. Buildings once used as instruments of displacement were being sold in the same market to a woman who had built her life around reversing that very calculus. Jordan's acquisition strategy with Vertex moved with the speed and caution of someone who had to do more than buy properties. She had to convert them into a living form of restitution. Vertex, backed by a consortium of mission-aligned investors and a modest infusion from philanthropic partners who preferred anonymity, bid on key assets and won. The fall of Braftoft's empire allowed Vertex to secure a portfolio for a fraction of the price they might have paid under normal consolidation. The trustee, mindful of maximizing creditor returns and avoiding controversy, still transferred ownership under court oversight. Once under Vertex's control, the buildings did not instantly become utopias. Converting a portfolio, linked to a pattern of extraction into a system of care required thoughtful governance. Jordan established Wells Community Development, an independent nonprofit arm of Vertex tasked with long-term stewardship. The plan allocated units for affordable housing at rents tied to area median income, reserved commercial spaces for local small businesses, and created a workforce training center aimed at hiring from among the neighborhoods that had been hardest hit. There were meetings with architects, town planners, tenant associations, and city officials. There was red tape and resistance, and there were also small triumphs that tasted like gasoline and coffee. Renovations began where once maintenance had been deferred. Building staff were rehired with living wages and health benefits. A tenant advisory board was formed with real authority over neighborhood programming. Jordan insisted on governance that could not be commandeered by a single personality: boards, community representation, transparent reporting. She insisted that Wells Community Development publish audited yearly impact reports and open its books to public scrutiny. One of the first beneficiaries of the new approach was Ashley Morrison, a young mother who had lost her apartment in a building once under Braftoft's management and had spent years moving between shelters and temporary placements. Ashley attended a job training program that taught HVAC basics and building operations, skills that directly related to the needs of the properties Vertex was rehiring. She emerged with a certification and a job on a crew renovating units where she would one day live at an affordable rate. "I used to think stability was a word people used in slogans," Ashley told a small group at a community meeting. Her voice found a microphone and steadied itself. "Now it's what I'm clocking into every morning." The Wells Community Development sought to be more than housing. Jordan wanted the holdings to be infrastructural, a childhood food pantry, a legal clinic to assist tenants, and most symbolically, the Evelyn Wells Community Center, an inviting brick building with a modest plaque on its facade bearing her mother's name. The center included classrooms, a small business incubator, and an intergenerational room where older residents could teach crafts to neighborhood youth. The dedication day felt like a compression of the story's moral arc. There were speeches that were both simple and weighty. Jordan stood at the podium with a photograph of Evelyn at her side, smoothed by time. Her speech was not a sermon. It was a ledger and a promise. "When my mother lost her job, no one offered her an incubator for dignity," Jordan said. "They offered bureaucratic forms and silence. We will not reproduce that silence. This center is not me. It's Evelyn's life made into action. It's for people who do the work of living and whose work is worth more than a headline." She introduced Ashley and other beneficiaries, each of whom shared short remarks about what they'd gained. An elderly neighbor who had once protested eviction stood with a small bouquet and recited the way the community had persevered in the face of being ignored. Jordan closed by answering a question she'd been holding since the ballroom. When you are present and you see wrongdoing, what will you do? Will you be a witness or a bystander? She asked the assembled crowd. She did not demand heroics. She suggested tools, documentation, recorded testimony, calls to counsel, public statements when appropriate. She asked for small acts of courage that accumulate into systemic pressure. The dedication was also careful about limits. Jordan acknowledged that one man's fall did not cure structural injustice. She did not dramatize Braftoft's downfall as a universal win. She emphasized that institutions remained, and that vigilance required continued oversight. We turned an incident into an institution, she said. That is progress. It is not the end. Public reaction to the Wells projects was varied. Some hailed it as an example of restorative outcomes, assets reclaimed and redirected for public good. Others pointed out the fragility of such wins. Leadership could change, funding could dry up, and entrenched systems could reassert themselves. Jordan accepted those critiques in public forums and invited independent auditors to assess Wells Community Development's performance annually. Braftoft's family life frayed in a way that the tabloids savored without nuance. Elizabeth, his wife, released a statement that read like grief. Our family is processing this privately. Their children issued shorter, clipped messages. Madison posted that she would be stepping back from public life to consider her responsibilities. Tyler's social feed was quiet. The family dynamics were less a spectacle than a human fracture, one that did not absolve the man at its center. In prison, Braftoft had time to write op-eds that were refused and to sit with the consequences of actions he once assumed would be epiphenomena in a ledger of his accomplishment. He did not become a martyr. He became, rather, an example, one that the city could point to when discussing the cost of unaccountable privilege. There was no satisfaction in narrating his punishment. The story's gravity lay elsewhere, in the reparative work that followed, and in the lives that changed because someone chose to convert humiliation into a mechanism for accountability. Along the way, policy changes rippled in corporate corridors, sometimes sincere and sometimes cosmetic. Some boards revised codes of conduct and formed independent oversight committees. Investor groups introduced stricter clauses around reputational risk. Not every reform was deep. Not every company joined the Wells model. Structural inertia remained stubborn. But where policy met enforcement, there was a tangible difference in the lives of certain tenants and employees. Numbers mattered. The Wells housing portfolio reached 2,200 affordable units within 2 years. The community center ran 42 workforce classes in its first year and placed 183 people in jobs tied to the operations of the properties. Those figures were not a replacement for systemic reform, but they were measurable consequences of what had happened that night. Court-ordered injunctions required Braftoft properties, now under trustee management, to contribute to a fund dedicated to tenant remediation. The civil judgment of $250 million settled in a complex array of stock transfers, property sales, and cash payouts. Creditors received a fraction of face value. Many former employees received directly administered settlements. The law had done what law could do: assign liability, redistribute capital, and create enforceable conditions. Jordan's work filled some of the spaces law could not fill: direct reinvestment, programmatic design, and cultural stewardship. The courtroom testimonies remained, for many, seared into public consciousness. They offered a template for how evidence and courage could intersect, how ordinary people and institutional actors could redesign risk. The blogs and op-eds that had earlier debated cancel culture now wrote about the durability of corporate governance clauses. The morality clause, Section 14, Paragraph 3, entered case studies in law schools and business ethics classes, not as a novelty, but as a lever. Through it all, Jordan's public posture stayed consistent. She never framed the saga as an individual triumph of vengeance. Instead, she emphasized procedure, testimony, and patient conversion of outrage into enforceable outcomes. Her words to him at the boardroom were echoed in speeches and articles, short phrases that carried the story's spine. Thank you for showing me who you are. We are nothing alike. I earned my seat. They became shorthand for an approach that prized dignity and governance over spectacle. The story's moral remainder was not tidy. There were people who resented the public shaming, who argued for private atonement, who saw the market's response as mob justice. There were also people who had sat in boardrooms and watched the calculus of reputation determine policy, publicly indifferent but privately decisive. Jordan's campaign did not erase that complexity. It leveraged it. There were, too, quieter consequences. Some former employees who had testified said publicly that they felt heard. Keisha Washington, once an HR director who feared for her livelihood, began teaching community seminars on workplace rights. Maria Santos started a tenant advocacy nonprofit that partnered with Wells Community Development to mediate disputes before they became litigious. Ashley Morrison, who had once doubted the meaning of stability, later joined a tenant board and worked to ensure that new hires in building operations were sourced from the same neighborhood served by Wells. There were limits Jordan acknowledged with a plainness that some found discomforting. "We buy buildings," she told a podcast interviewer. "We convert units. We fund programs. But a center is not a cure. We reduce harm in places we can reach. We lobby for stronger tenant protections. We support legislation that tightens accountability for corporate landlords. But systems are deep, and progress is uneven." Months into the recovery and rebuilding work, the Evelyn Wells Community Center hosted a panel on bystander intervention. The panel convened municipal officials, tenant leaders, and legal scholars. Jordan was there but did not dominate the conversation. She had learned the value of scaffolding leaders rather than occupying every stage. The final question from the young moderator was simple and direct. "What do you want people to do if they witness humiliation?" Jordan answered without theatrics. "Document, be precise, save copies. If you can, make direct contact with the person harmed and ask what they want. Find legal support and make a record. Don't assume someone else will act. Ask. Step forward. The smallest act of bearing witness is the first legal beat of accountability." The narrative closed around her not with a sense of victory, but with a ledger of consequence. There were audits and reports and a slow accretion of small changes in practice across several property management firms. There were also setbacks. A few properties in other markets fell into mismanagement. A new investor with a glossy pitch threatened a different sort of extraction. The story illustrated that justice requires continued attention, not just a headline. In the final scene, soft, not triumphant, Jordan walked the hallway of a renovated building and paused at a door with a small postcard taped to it. It was from a tenant whose name she now knew. A family that had previously been moved out with the kind of bland language that once erased people. The postcard read, in a careful hand, "Thank you. We sleep easier." Jordan smiled not because the postcard solved everything, but because it represented a small transfer of dignity. The last public act of the narrative was the unveiling of a modest plaque at the Evelyn Wells Community Center. The plaque did not gloat. It simply stated a provenance. A building restored to community use, a fund established for workforce development, affordable units preserved, legal clinics set up for tenants. Jordan spoke for a few minutes, and then stepped back. The microphone collected a few more testimonies from tenants and program graduates. The ribbon was cut. Cameras flashed, but the day belonged to ordinary comings and goings. Kids signing up for summer classes, an older woman teaching knitting in a corner, a small business owner moving into a storefront. Justice in the story did not look like vengeance. It looked like paperwork honored, homes saved, lives given modest stability, and an institution designed to be accountable. The ruin of one man's empire had led, through law and strategy and witness, to resources redirected and lives rebuilt. The title claim, "The Billionaire Who Mocked a Black CEO and Dumped Food on Her and Then Had His $1 billion deal canceled," had been fulfilled in sequence. The gala humiliation became a viral record. Markets reacted. CEK invoked a morality clause and withdrew from the merger. Criminal and civil processes followed. Assets shifted into new stewardship, and the Wells Community Development began the work of repair. 2 years later, at an annual report for Wells Community Development, Jordan closed with a question she had asked months before. "When you see humiliation," she told the audience, some live, some watching a live stream. Will you be a witness or a bystander? She left the question hanging as if it were an invitation rather than a reproach. If this story matters to you, share it with someone who needs to see how accountability can be pursued without spectacle. Tell us below. When you see humiliation, will you be a witness or a bystander? And if you want more stories where accountability wins, subscribe for updates on similar cases, restorative efforts, and the people rebuilding what power breaks.